episode of Mind the Gap with me and Tom Sherrington and our wonderful guests today, Mark McCourt. And they say never meet your heroes, so I apologise in advance if I'm tripping over my words, sounding like a complete idiot, because it's an absolute pleasure and a joy to talk to Mark this afternoon. And just to prove I am a fan, Mark, here's your book. Not only do I have the book, but inside the book it is scribbled on all the way through, because you don't know this, but you came with me to Menorca a couple of years ago when this came out. And I read it, and sort of alone on the sunbed in Menorca was shouting, "This is amazing, this is brilliant," like some kind of crazy lady. But one of the things I really loved about that book, and that I love about you, is that everything that you talk about is rooted not only in masses of experience, because you've taught pretty much every age group there is to teach, but there's so much research that you reference in your writing and when you speak. But one of the best things I ever heard was our maths conference that you came to speak at, where you kind of myth busted how many people have got so much of the research wrong. Or misinterpreted it incorrectly. And I remember sitting on the edge of my seat listening to you when you kind of went, and that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. So my first question would be, what's the biggest misapplication or misunderstanding of educational research that you think people have? And what do you kind of wish they really knew about it?
Okay, so starting with an easy one then, Emma.
I can remind you what you said at the conference if you like.
Yeah, it's tricky that, you know, there are a lot of myths around, and very rarely because of any bad will. I think that's really important to say, that you don't meet teachers, or it's extraordinarily rare to meet a teacher who thinks, I'm going to drive to work today and try and do a bad job. They don't really exist. So there's always an enormous amount of goodwill, but we are in a profession where time is tight, and acquiring that domain knowledge is incredibly difficult to do. And what often happens then is, because time is tight, and because initial teacher education, initial teacher training is not really fit for purpose in a lot of cases. Not in so much that it's not very good, but that people forget the initial part of it. They forget that this is just an intro. You're not a qualified teacher at the end of this. You're not an expert teacher. It's going to take you years and years and years to become an expert teacher. We're just kicking you off, and we're going to tell you some interesting stuff. And this is the start of a journey. And sometimes it's considered that's your teacher training, and that's all you need to know, and you can do the career now. So that thing of time being really tight drives a behavior of people wanting pithy summaries. So one thing I get a lot, people very often tweet me and say, could you just tell me in a tweet what your book is about? Which, yes, it's understandable, you know, what are the key messages of this? And you think, well, no, it's quite a tricky idea, the book. That's why it's a book. And it does take time to read and take time to think about these things. So I'm kind of dodging your question by saying that there are so many myths, but they exist for a reason. For me, obviously, the misapplication of mastery is a big problem. It being distilled into silly little fads and tricks is a big problem. There are lots and lots and lots of models of education, and mastery is an entire model of education. It's a way of educating. And there are loads of models that exist, and you know, depending on which grand narrative you choose for your education system, there are models that are suitable for those grand narratives. And what you often see is that people will take a model like mastery and try to apply it to the wrong grand narrative. Try to say, so this profound, complex approach to teaching children can be distilled into a few little tricks. And that's pretty problematic. So I'm going to, maybe this is controversial, but I don't know. I try not to be controversial, as you know.
Yeah, we do know.
You're so middle of the road, Mark. Get off the fence.
So maybe this is the biggest problem, that people have misunderstood the domain of social studies. And social studies are about documentary. They're about documenting something that happens, something I've seen to happen. They're really important. History is really, really important as well, or history's really important. So for example, one of the things I'm seeing a lot in schools at the moment are people who will do something like, they'll say, what I'm going to do now is have interleaving in my lessons. Well, okay. Interleaving means something in normal English language, and people tend to just pop an idea into the head and think, so that's what interleaving means. And if I take my own subject area, there's not a shred of evidence, not a single bit, not a single piece of evidence at all that interleaving has an impact on learning mathematics. Nothing exists. What there is there are several people, Rohr and Taylor in particular, who have documented what they observed in laboratory conditions when some people were doing some mathematical tasks, usually undergraduates. And I stress a lot the difference between propositional knowledge. So someone saying, I think that this might be the case. So I think that if you take the idea of interleaving, which is about disrupting a moment of thinking, if you take that idea, I think it might have an impact in learning mathematics. Okay, that's quite an interesting proposition. And then beyond that, you get case knowledge, where some real teachers say to you, I tried this in my practice and it did actually have an impact. And that's really interesting. You take these teachers in good faith. If they have tried it and it has had an impact in the classroom, that's an interesting thing. Then beyond that, you get to strategic knowledge, where someone proposed something, I heard some case studies, and I tried it in my practice, and I noticed something happening. And what I try to do when I write is to only write about things that have passed through those three gateways. So I try to avoid, which is where these myths come from, where you get very limited laboratory condition studies proposing something like interleaving, and then loads of people say it works, and therefore we'll change everything we do, or we'll get rid of starters and we'll do retrieval practice now. Okay, well, why? Because a study of 40 undergraduates showed that that might be an interesting thing to do. Well, you want to think about that more. You want to think about what happened in real classrooms with real teachers, with real people in these situations. What happens in your situation before you make these big, profound changes to your structure of how you educate. So the biggest myth, I think, going back to the actual question, the biggest myth is that documentary is the same as evidence, and it isn't. Documentary
that's quite broad, isn't it? I mean, that applies to so many things. I mean, you've thrown in there sort of mastery itself, kind of interleaving as just an idea, retrieval practice, and where that fits. I mean, I do think that's interesting. So, I mean, one of my understandings about interleaving, for example, is it comes from some studies where people have been looking at whether or not you can remember the names of some categories of butterflies on cards, and if you mix up the categories, you space that over time, you end up having a better recall of the categories than if you just chunked up one type and then another and then another. So that's a very specific type of recall, isn't it? And you're not saying that doesn't apply in maths concepts at all, but it's just that it just doesn't directly translate. I mean, what sort of, does that type of effect have a place in maths where you sort of mix up conceptual areas?
Yes, absolutely. And you know, I write about that, Tom, because it has passed those gateways, you know. So you get maybe the butterfly study, or maybe the study about paintings, or maybe the study about throwing beanbags is a big interleaving study. Study of toddlers where you play a very loud, very disturbing noise at them when they're playing games, just every now and then, like white noise. So lots of these studies exist in these domains. And then there has gone beyond that into case study, particularly Rohr and Taylor in mathematics, but other people as well, and then into strategic study. And actually, if you ask a load of teachers who'd never heard the phrase interleaving, if you ask a load of teachers, do you think it's more powerful to try to get pupils to recognize the similarity in an idea, Or do you think it's more powerful to get them to recognize the differences and boundary conditions of a mathematical idea? And most math teachers will say it's the latter, because we've been teaching math for an extraordinarily long time, and we know really rather a lot about teaching mathematics. So intuitively, teachers will know that there is something powerful in that. I guess the point I'm making is that not to take pithy summaries of very, very small studies and make profound changes to your system based on those studies.
Yeah.
Rather, you may well come across propositional knowledge which you think is interesting and you think we could try this out, and maybe there are aspects of this that I want to find out about in my practice. That's great, go off and do that. But again, you're only documenting what happened in your practice, in your classrooms, with those particular children, in your particular subject. And I think subject specificity is really rather important.
Yeah. Well, can I ask you about the mastery? Because this was my sort of first question that came to me, and I was thinking I wanted to ask you is, because I come across this a lot going from school to school, where people will say to me, I say, I just asked them an opening question about their maths curriculum, and they'll say, oh yeah, we do a mastery maths curriculum. Yeah. And sometimes, I think, God, I wonder if it's the one that Mark McCourt would approve of. And sometimes they say, oh, we use the Singapore mastery, so they'll give it a name, and because that makes it sound good, or maybe it really is. But so my experience is that out there, people's sense of that mastery is kind of up for discussion is quite strong and varied. But you're very clear that it's a specific sort of school of thought. So how would you kind of, I know, and I'm not in a position to say, well, go and read a book. It's difficult, because sometimes you need to say, well, it's not this, it's this. Is there a way of sort of capturing the essence of mastery, which allow you to sort of test out whether people are following a kind of a coherent model of it?
Yeah, I think it is important to address that issue that, people say I'm doing a mastery curriculum, whatever. Is it the mastery curriculum that I would espouse? Well, it can't be, because I wouldn't suggest any such thing exists. Mastery is not a curriculum. It is a model of schooling. It's an approach to how you educate, and it's based on a grand narrative. It's based on a reason for education, a purpose you have decided for schooling. One of the things that administrators and public policy people will often do is, if they wish to make a change and they wish to take people along with them on the change, they will pick up a word which is already loved, adored, and understood, and then take that word with them, so that you can introduce any old tosh under the name of mastery and say, well, you can't argue with this, Mark, can you? Because you're a great proponent of a mastery approach, and we call this mastery. So that word has been hijacked. The Singapore thing is interesting. The Singapore model of education is really quite an interesting approach. Most of it drawn from the UK in the 1980s and early 1990s. Singapore was doing very badly. Mastery was quite widespread in the 80s in the UK, and people came along and adopted lots of those approaches. It's been around such a long time and so well documented and so well codified that I remember, I think it was Tom Guskey in 2005 writing something along the lines of, mastery is now so well understood and researched that people don't even bother arguing about it anymore, which is really weird in education research.
Yeah.
People like to argue about stuff. So we had got to a point where the whole world kind of agreed that this is the approach that we're talking about when we use the word mastery. And I've heard over the last few years, I've heard schools saying things like, we do mastery. I don't mean Bloom's mastery. I mean, whatever. And that's quite an interesting sentence. You hear people say, I don't mean Bloom's mastery, because, everyone thinks Bloom was a crackpot because of that bloody pyramid, even though he didn't write the bloody pyramid. They want to distance themselves from that. Well, if you don't mean Bloom's mastery, you don't mean mastery. I mean, it really is that simple. Right. Bloom took Carlton Washburn's work of the 1910s and 1920s, and Bloom did a load of research and a load of codifying and saying these are the key ingredients, this is how the approach works, this is the impact that you have. So although it is not an approach that comes from Bloom, Benjamin S. Bloom was definitely the main sort of documenter of the approach. In a nutshell, you're talking about a responsive model of teaching. You're talking about understanding what pupils know and don't know, and teaching them the stuff they don't know. And it's
sounds so easy.
Yeah, it's not rocket science, right? But it's weird that model is so incredibly out of fashion at the moment. It is not normal in schools for schools to work out what children don't know and teach them that stuff. It's not normal at all. All across the Northwestern cultures, the norm is consider how old the child is and teach them the arbitrary stuff we think a child that age knows or should know. That's the dominant model. The dominant model is the child is 11, so they must be served up the 11-year-old stuff. They're 14, they must be served up the 14-year-old stuff. And it's a remarkably odd situation.
Yeah.
And there are loads and loads of subjects that take a mastery approach and always have taken a mastery approach. Music teaching takes a mastery approach. The sports teacher takes a mastery approach. You generally don't meet a sports teacher who says, well, Tom, you're 14, so you must be able to jump 2.1 meters. And, I don't care if you can only do 30 centimeters, that bar's going at 2.1 meters. They generally don't do that, right? Sports teachers, they generally work out how high the kid can jump or how fast they can run, and they incrementally push them on bit by bit by bit by bit, building on foundations, which is really what mastery is about, working out where they're truly secure and building upon and on and on, so that they are really meaningfully learning as they're.
So you have to have this contingent planning. So you can't really write a scheme. What, Emma? What were you gonna? Are you gonna come with your question? Are you gonna follow up there?
I was going to ask about. It's funny you say foundation, because I remember, you probably don't remember, I sat with you at lunch at the conference, Mark. Didn't wash for a week. No. And we talked about early years. And you said over lunch to me that you thought the early years teacher needs to be the most skilled teacher in the school.
Yeah.
And I was absolutely fascinated by what you said. And I've thought about it ever since and done lots of kind of reading around it just from that one conversation. But it was the way you explained why they needed to be the most skilled that I found absolutely fascinating. So I'm just really keen for you to articulate for anybody who's listening exactly, why that is so important.
Yeah, well, it comes to this foundational thing. Maybe at your event I used this metaphor. I can't recall, but I often talk about this idea of a subject, hierarchical subjects, being like a giant Jenga block, giant block of wooden blocks, and playing the game. And the reason that children don't succeed at the end of high school, the reason they don't get the top grade at the end of high school, is never to do with the blocks at the top. Never. It's because the blocks down the bottom are missing or wobbly. And mathematics, like lots of other subjects, mathematics is an hierarchical subject. It really is. And people will try to say, no, it's not the case at all. It is. And I've got no time for that argument of, you can just learn it in any order. It is hierarchical. And if you're 5 years old and somebody serves up to you place value and you don't grip place value, and then the curriculum just keeps moving on because you're now 6 and 7 and 8 and you must be taught the age 8 stuff. If you didn't grip place value when you were 5, your mathematical journey is finished. It's over, completely over. And that's why we meet children all around the world, and the Northwestern cultures are particularly acute at this, but it is why we meet 15-year-olds who can't number 1 to 10, who can't do simple arithmetic, because this conveyor belt that they were on of you're this age, you're this age, you're this age, because that conveyor belt just moves on and on and on and on, not taking any account at all of what they have gripped and what they've not gripped. If you miss something, it's over. And, we get kids going into high school, maybe they're 11 years old, and they can't number bond to 10, or they can't work with simple numbers, or they don't understand what place value is, or what a fraction is, or whatever it is. And they arrive at the start of high school, and the high school teacher serves up at them finding the nth term of a linear sequence.
Which is fun if you know what you're doing.
Indeed, nth term of a linear sequence is absolutely appropriate for the child who's at that stage of learning.
So the other thing that we spoke about was specialist teaching, about having specialist teachers as early as possible.
Yeah.
And it was, so my question would be, at what age broadly? I know you've mentioned you can't do the age 8 thing at age 8, but if you could kind of set the system, from what point broadly would you want a specialist teacher to be teaching children?
There seems to be something, and it's really hard to put your finger on it, because education researchers who've been looking at this for a really long time, lots and lots of different studies, there seems to be something in early years. And by early years, I mean the international view of early years, not the UK view of early years, but up to around about age 7 or age 8. There seems to be something up to around about that age where the relationship, the one-to-one relationship that you have with that human being outweighs the importance of subject-specific knowledge. And it's really hard to put your finger on, because generally you don't have specialist teaching there. So it's quite hard to find reliable information on that. But I'd say that's about right, 7, 8, thereabouts. And I'd suggest at that point, subject-specific pedagogical knowledge outweighs the interpersonal relationship with a human being. Any parent knows this. 5-year-old, 6-year-old, there's something about knowing that person, right?
Yeah.
There's something about knowing Miss Turner and that relationship and how you get on with them that is fundamentally important. But I wouldn't actually teach formal mathematics in early years anyway, but that's just another box of frogs altogether, and we'll just get...
I love that box. I love that box, Mark. I love that box.
I remember seeing a study which said that it was in a US study. It was about maths teaching, where sort of slightly less effective teachers, I don't know, this is in some rating system, but teaching the same students for 2 years got better outcomes than a more effective teacher normally doing it for less time. But then I guess you could combine the two, and if you have the same specialist maths teacher for more than 1 year, then they do get to know you, and they do get to know what you know about maths.
You know, that's borne out in my own practice, because in the school that I worked in, sometimes I had year 6, sometimes I had a mix of year 5 and 6. And when I kept those year 5s into year 6, oh my God, the difference in terms of the pace that you could work at, the knowledge that you had of their understanding, the knowledge they had of the way you work, keeping children for longer, in my experience.
So one of the things I think is so interesting from what you've just said then, because de facto what happens is that students do diverge. I mean, I've had the same experience. I work with FE colleges where you have the resit maths class where students don't have an intuition for a quarter meaning a size and a fifth being smaller. They think that might be bigger because 5 sounds bigger than 4. And you think, blimey, how did you get to this point? That divergence happens pretty early. So but then there's people, and there's some people are pretty vociferous about it. Is clear. Mixed ability teaching is more effective than maths. And in fact, it's a kind of disgrace in some people's minds that we have setting in maths, because it's so, it locks in disadvantage. So what's your view of that?
It depends on the grand narrative that you're looking at, which therefore determines the model of education you should take. There are grand narratives in education, which I don't subscribe to, but there are grand narratives in education, for example, where, I don't know, what's that grand narrative? Equity, right? That's an equity grand narrative. I don't subscribe to that grand narrative. But if that is the grand narrative you want for your education system or your school, your specific school, and you think that segregating children in any way whatsoever is abhorrent, super, go for it. Do that thing if you want to do it. There's no evidence to say that if you take a conveyor belt model, which is what most schools use, that either setting or mixed ability have a better outcome, right? So it's a tricky thing because everyone does these studies and they're so ideologically driven. Everyone does these studies in mixed ability and setting, and you know, they always prove the thing you want them to prove, always, right? No matter what the data says. You've been given a grant to show mixed ability is effective, that's what you're going to find out. If you've been given a grant and you're going to find out settings effective, that's what you're going to find out, because there's nothing between them if you're following a conveyor belt model. Well, I would suggest not following a conveyor belt model at all. I'd suggest following the appropriate model for the approach you're going to take. And if you take a mastery approach, it simply is not possible to do a mastery approach and a mixed ability approach where the attainment gap is large. They don't go together. They are opposing models that diametrically opposite to each other. Now, that isn't saying, because I'm a proponent of a mastery model, that isn't saying I think that no one should do mixed ability or no one should have the grand narrative of equity. I rather think that schools should be allowed to choose their grand narrative, which is quite controversial. Everyone thinks, well, you know, the argument I get is people say, but it's taxpayers' money, therefore all schools must be the same. I don't like the idea of all human beings being the same. I think it leads to quite a dull life. So if you want to do that and you want to do mixed ability, that's fine. But if you want to do a mastery approach, it's really, really important that you're able to ensure that pupils are gripping every single thing that they come up against. And if you look at the outcome of conveyor belt and mixed or setted, doesn't matter, but conveyor belt is the problem. If you look at the outcome of that, in the UK, it's not very different than the US, quite similar. In the UK, aged 11, the attainment gap in a normal average school, the attainment gap between the highest attaining child and the lowest attaining child is about 7 years worth of learning in mathematics. And every maths teacher in secondary school knows this. Every maths teacher has met a child pretty good at algebra and a child can't add up. You know, so a child who's operating at a 4 or 5 year old and a child that's operating normally at an 11-year-old sort of expectation. There's your outcome. You know, that's the outcome of a conveyor belt, that you create this enormous divergence. And then look at countries that don't do that. Look at jurisdictions around the Pacific Rim where that's not the case and they don't do this conveyor belt and they are taking a type of mastery approach, or when it has happened in previous jurisdictions throughout history, that gap becomes much, much less. And that's the real problem. The real problem is you've got a bunch of 11-year-olds with a 7-year attainment gap. And people say, well, you can still teach them mixed, 7-year attainment gap. There are activities you can do. And this is true, by the way. There are activities you can do with someone that's operating at a 4-year-old and someone's operating at an 11-year-old. It's hard and it's tiring. And they're really hard to plan, but really good teachers pull this off all the time and have done for many years. They've pulled it off with these big attainment gaps. But, you know, you can just ad absurdum break this apart. Would you have a pupil who can't count in the same classroom as someone who is learning Fourier series? Right? And the answer to that is no, that's a stupid idea. Right? So everybody agrees there is a gap. There is a point where that gap becomes so large that you wouldn't put them in the same class together. Well, what is that size? What is that size of gap? And I'm going to suggest that 7 years is way, way, way beyond where that gap is appropriate. So, yeah, it's just different models.
We could talk to you forever. I mean, in the book, I mean, people who haven't read it, I mean, there's this whole just fantastic, mind-blowing section about Cuisenaire rods, and you know, this is where you sort of start solving these problems, and I love that. But the thing I is, if I have like want to ask you one more thing, it would be this: in your model, which you talk about, which is teach, do, practice, behave, and you which I think is fantastically interesting. This idea of behave, like so, math at some point, students should aspire to behave like mathematicians, and I love that whole notion. But the question I have is that what does that look like? Is that the same as sort of maths investigations, or does it come just at the end of a long sequence and you just hardly reach, that only a few students will reach, or is it something you do a bit of throughout, progressively? I just want
just on Fridays, Tom. That's it. You just think on Fridays.
Yeah, I think it's really important. It's happening all the time. One of the things that sometimes surprises maths educators is that not many people go off and study maths or become mathematicians. Yeah, if you said to a piano teacher, teach a kid piano for 11 years, but never let them touch the keyboard, would they go and become a pianist? Well, of course they wouldn't. If you don't get opportunities to behave mathematically, behave like a mathematician throughout your schooling, why would you choose to become one? What is it that would make you want to be one? So I think it is important. It's happening all the time, and this really is, so the teach, do, practice, behave part in the book is beyond the mastery model. So I'm a big proponent of a mastery model, but the mastery model stops at a place that I'm uncomfortable with. And that that comes to that grand narrative thing, that there is a grand narrative of education. You could set your schools up to say, like the kind of Matthew Arnold thing of the purpose of our school is that we will expose children to the best that has been thought and said, right? You could take that model. It's quite a popular model at the moment with quite a lot of people. I know lots of people that subscribe to that idea that children should be exposed to the best that's been thought and said and written and documented, and the best art, the best culture, and all that kind of stuff. And I don't think that's okay. That to me smacks of paternalism. That to me says what we want for the poor is that they should know about all our good things, but they must not have the mechanisms to themselves continue the ascent of humanity, continue creating good things. And those mechanisms are what I'm trying to do with the behave phase. You can get someone to know an enormous amount about mathematics, get them to be very knowledgeable, give them a set of marketable skills. They can go off and be a programmer or an accountant or whatever it is, give them a bunch of marketable skills. But that doesn't give them the mechanisms to add to the discipline of mathematics. It doesn't give them the mechanisms that allow them to continue the ascent of mathematics. And that's the grand narrative I subscribe to.
Well, it's interesting because at the beginning of the national curriculum, in the curriculum overview for maths for Key Stage 1 and 2, it talks about developing a love of maths and understanding the inherent beauty of the subject.
Yeah.
And I often ask on some of my training, look at your planning for the last week for maths. Whereabouts was the opportunity to explore the inherent beauty of maths? And people just go, oh, I didn't realise I had to make it beautiful. And I'm like, not talking about laminating things and making things look pretty. I actually look at the way that it makes you think, the way that it's unique. Where is the conversation around maths as a discipline? Right from the word go, but it's there in the national curriculum. If you actually have a look, it says for the curriculum overview, that's what we should be doing.
Yeah, I think there is a difference though, Emma, to getting people to appreciate the inherent beauty of mathematics, or a painting, or a piece of music, or a piece of literature, or whatever your subject is. There's a difference between that and then the thing that should follow that, because the thing that should follow that is, I find this so awe-inspiring that I want to contribute to this domain.
Yeah.
And if you look at mathematics classrooms, that doesn't happen very often. So what children learn in mathematics classrooms is that every bit of knowledge is in this person at the front, and my job is to listen to them and take that knowledge in. So that's fine, and that is the giving them access to the best that's been thought and said kind of approach. And okay, fine. But what they learn is, or what they don't learn is, there's a part for me to ask questions. There's a part for me to debate. There's a part for me to query. There's a part for me to challenge. And if you don't, in your education system, if you don't leave your education system filled with the ability to ask questions, to challenge, to debate, to look at documentary history, history of mathematics, history of science, philosophy of science, if you don't learn about semantics, how to interrogate truth, if you don't leave your education system with those things, I'm not sure it was an education.
So, this to me sounds like, I mean, I can think of various examples of this. I mean, I've heard you, it's one of my favorite conference things I've ever heard, was you talking about how you could start with 4 plus 6 equals 10. And then you could start to say, well, 4 plus what else equals 10? And then what plus what might equal 10? And then what operation what might 10? And then what operation what equals whatever. And it's like the whole thing explodes into this ever expanding thing of how do we combine any two numbers into another number. And that to me was like exciting, because I was thinking, well, I don't often see teachers teach that way. But it seemed to me, is that the kind of thing that you're saying, that type of exploratory thing should be more sort of normalized in the flow of a sequence of lessons?
Yeah, so in that little example, Tom, what I'm doing there is, so that's in part of my teach bit, I'm instructing at that point. If you want children to be able to question and challenge and to behave mathematically, because that's really what mathematicians do. Mathematicians are just curious beasts. They're curious about everything. Mathematicians love being stuck. They love being puzzled. They love scratching their head and furrowing their brow. If you want children to do all that, you're their role model. So one of the things that you have to do in front of children is to act out in front of them being a mathematician. And I do this, speaking my internal monologue a lot in front of kids. It's not real, of course, I'm acting it. I'm when I come across a problem, I say, oh my goodness, I don't know how to resolve this. Now, of course, I do know how to resolve it, and we're going to resolve it in the lesson. But I want them to see part of what a mathematician does is they come up against something, they don't know the resolution, and instead of going, can't do it, they go, oh, this is interesting. I don't know the resolution to this. And mathematicians aren't particularly interested in things where, well, that's obvious, I know the resolution to that. They're interested in things that make them go, oh, what's this? And these little pedagogic choices, like the one you were describing there, which is all it is, it's just a pedagogic choice. I could have given you 50 questions of adding two integers together, right? Could have done that. And that would be a normal kind of approach that lots of teachers take. And all I'm doing there is making a pedagogic choice that creates in the children in front of me their questions in their heads, and also spoken out loud as well, because they'll start saying in that particular example, they will themselves, when I remove the operation, they'll say, can we do multiplication? So, if you want to. And then they quite like the challenge then of, oh, hang on a minute, I can do better than that. Are we allowed to use powers? Yeah, if you want to. Are we allowed to use reciprocals? Sure, if you want to. Can we use, yeah, if you want, and you're trying to create an atmosphere where they themselves realize that, okay, this guy knows a lot about maths. He's going to expose me to lots of maths in an order that makes sense so that I always grip it. But there's a big part of the deal of learning mathematics, which is that I must be curious, and I must question, and I must challenge, and I must debate. And that's all that is. That was just one little example of role-playing it in front of the children, doing your internal monologue in front of them,
Which is what we do very well in guided writing, but that's not necessarily transferred into the teaching of maths.
Yeah.
Word choice and why you would put that there, and I want to create this, and what could and you do all of that. You do that internal monologue and make that real, but it becomes so dry and procedural so many times when you transfer that into the teaching of maths. It becomes all about getting the procedure in the right order rather than creating that.
Yeah, maybe because in modern history, mathematics is the subject that more than any subject was hijacked into the marketable skills. Mathematics has been considered by policymakers, by industry, has been considered as a tool, a means to an end, rather than the end itself. Mathematics for the sake of mathematics, you know, that seems to have been forgotten. Whereas industry, policymakers, governments haven't quite so much hijacked poetry. Not quite so much.
I'll tell you what, I'm conscious we're really coming to the end now. I just want to give you a chance because I mean, both Emma and I are massive fans of your previous book about mastery, but I only picked up just today actually via a tweet from John Catt that you have another book coming, which sounds like I just want to grab hold of it. But tell us what that is and what, you know, who you've written it with. Yeah,
so this new book's out on 1st of October, and it's called Mathematical Tasks, which Chris McGrain, a colleague of mine, we had this idea a while back of interviewing a load of people in mathematics education, deliberately from the spectrum, right? Everything's got a spectrum now, so right the way across the spectrum of maths educators and different viewpoints, and interviewing people about what they think makes an effective mathematical task. And the subheading for it is the bridge between teaching and learning. And what we're trying to say is there's a load of stuff you know as a teacher, and you want the pupils to know this stuff too. There has to be a medium through which they will start to know this stuff. And we think that tasks, actually doing mathematics, undertaking meaningful mathematical tasks, is the medium in which you take a thing you know and translate it into eventually them knowing through this doing. So it's mainly Chris's book. I played my little bit in it. It's really, really fascinating, the different tasks that are in there and the different contributors that have taken part in that. So yeah, 1st of October, buy that, order that. I predict major sales. I think that sounds good. Brilliant. Well, honestly, it's been a real joy talking to you. I could listen to you talk about maths all day, and I really love the fact that you always say mathematics, because I think more people should say that. Mathematics with Mark McCourt, that's the thing. Honestly, it's been a real delight talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us, and I really look forward to reading your book. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Tom.